Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Wanted to talk about what's been happening in Greater West Asia and perhaps why it is happening right now. I have given this considerable thought. I have tried to apply my knowledge as a sociologist to the situation, and I will tell you what my tentative conclusions are. But again, these are only tentative conclusions. I admit I may be fully wrong, but I think it is perhaps a useful thing to share with you nonetheless. You can take it or leave it. The two nations which are involved in destroying Gaza, one, my own country, and the other, the colonial power of Greater West Asia, are collapsing from within. Why do I say that? Let's take the colonial power first. Every year, more people leave that country than enter. Why? Because the economy of that country is really, really bad. So there is a brain drain occurring in that colonial power in Greater West Asia. And the leaders of Greater West Asia know that. They know that their country is not what it used to be. And they are right. It is not. But putting on this big war, this big terrorist campaign, is a diversion, a pure diversion from the internal problems that are happening in the colonial power in Greater West Asia. It is a way of engaging, I guess you could say, in misdirection or sleight of hand, something that I used to do as a ventriloquist, basically trying to make people think that the figure or the dummy was the one who was talking and not me. That is sometimes called, really incorrectly, throwing your voice, because it is simply an illusion. You can't throw your voice. So, in effect, I think what that colonial power is doing is sleight of hand or misdirection. Look here, don't look there. Look at Gaza, don't look at the deterioration of the country that either you are living in or you are looking at. That, I think, is a major contributing factor as to why this terrorist campaign has been going on for as long as it has. Another is simply the lack of morality on the part of the leader, the head of state of that country. Even lack of morality sounds too weak to me. I would say, more accurately, moral incompetence, lack of morality. Since I see morality from the standpoint of moral realism, that means that I believe that morality is a part of the universe. It is embedded in the universe. It is not relative. It is real. Morality is the stuff that everything in the universe, including our own bodies, is made of. That is morality. And so when you see a country like that colonial power willing to throw out any semblance of morality or any semblance of even caring about morality, lying about what it is doing, claiming it is treating Gaza with respect, claiming it is getting food trucks into Gaza, when in fact precisely the opposite is happening. And that is not a matter of speculation. We have evidence, video evidence of IDF soldiers crushing the food that is meant for the Gazans, stopping the trucks from entering into Gaza, basically leading to mass starvation in Gaza. That, I think, is the ultimate goal of that colonial power. It wants to drive the Gazans out of Gaza. Why? Misdirection. Misdirection. Don't look here, look there. And sadly, I think that the misdirection is working. How many stories have you seen on the horrendous economic problems that are being faced by the colonial power I am talking about in recent times? How many? I haven't seen any. And yet I know what is happening in that colonial power. I know it because I read other sources of news that the average person does not consult. And so as a result of that, I am aware of the collapse of that country. The puppet, or one of the puppets of the United States, that is willing to bend every single law or principle or causal mechanism, take your pick, of morality in order to further their goals. Controlling Gaza. Getting the Gazans out of Gaza. Why? Well, I don't know. I can't be sure. But I would think that the leadership of that colonial power believes that if it can do that, if it can get a hold of Gaza, if it can kick the Gazans out of Gaza, whether into Egypt or whether into the sea, or perhaps even kill all or most of them, that it will have free reign over the land. Will that happen? Doubtfully. Why? Because that colonial power is killing Gazans, regular Gazans. It is not destroying Hamas. Hamas is well hidden. They are not on the brink of being destroyed. When this entire episode is over, if this entire episode will be over, Hamas will survive. It is the average Gazan, including babies in incubators, who will be killed. There are right now not enough homes for Gazans. The majority of homes have been destroyed. So even if the war were to end, even if the terrorist campaign against Gaza were to end right now, where would the Gazans go? There's no place to go, because that country and its military have gone into Gaza and destroyed it. When supply trucks show up with food, they are stopped by the military, who will then crush, smash, destroy the food supplies that are intended for Gazans. Again, the objective of that colonial power, despite all of the leader of that colonial power's pretensions of innocence, is to kill the Gazans. And you know, it may sadly succeed. Will it kill Hamas? I doubt it. But Hamas is no challenge to the colonial power. The colonial power can crush Hamas in an instant. So the colonial power has all the cards, and it is playing them to its own advantage. And once again, I think that the major reason for it is the deteriorating economy that exists in that country, that exists in the country that is perpetuating this genocide in Gaza. So I think that is what we can look at. And that is what perhaps we should look at and focus upon, that there is something working behind the scenes, and that something is the deterioration of the colonial power's economic system. Now, was the action in Gaza triggered by the jailbreak of Hamas? Yes. But it came at a very fortuitous time. And I'm sure the colonial powers leaders are very happy about that. It gave them an excuse to go into Gaza and to kill the residents there, to wipe out their homes and their food supplies, and even babies in incubators. All of them have become casualties of this new terrorist campaign in a long succession of terrorist campaigns by the colonial power. It is very sad, but again, don't look here, look there. That is misdirection. That is sleight of hand. Rather than looking specifically at what is happening in Gaza, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't. Indeed, I focus most of my energies looking at the destruction happening in Gaza. It consumes much of my time. But besides looking at Gaza, the tragedy, the humanitarian disaster that is Gaza, we should look at that colonial power and how the colonial power is being eaten from the inside out. That is happening right now, too. Is the media covering it? No. Is anybody talking about it that I can see? No. And yet that, I think, is the instigator for the actions by the colonial power in Gaza, and perhaps later against Hezbollah in Lebanon. It is a real tragedy, and a tragedy that could have been avoided. The problem is the colonial power did not want to avoid it. It could have, because the colonial power, again, practicing sleight of hand or magic, is saying, look at Gaza. Don't look at us. Don't look at how our economy is rapidly falling apart, which it is. The Israel of 2024 is not the Israel of even 10 years ago. The system of the colonial power is really in horrendous shape. I don't know how much longer it has, but perhaps I think its leaders believe that by having a war with Gaza, and maybe after that with Lebanon, maybe after that with the West Bank, I don't know, that it can keep the attention focused on the genocide, or perhaps eventually genocides, and not on itself. It does not want the world to look at itself. Clearly, it is preventing the world as best it can from looking at itself. And its rapidly deteriorating economic conditions. Second, the US, a country I will always mention by name because it is the country that I live in. It is my home. I have no problem talking about the United States. It is where I have lived my entire life. I hate it. I have hated it for decades. I am perhaps the greatest opponent of the United States in the United States. And when I say opponent, I don't mean violent opponent or military opponent. I mean intellectual opponent, because I am challenging the status quo. I am challenging what the American government apparently wants people to believe. And so, despite the fact that Biden is supporting the colonial power of Greater West Asia, despite that, despite the fact that simultaneously his poll numbers have been going down, 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 his chances of being reelected as president now seem somewhat remote. Now, admittedly, that can change, because Trump apparently has even more Zionist sympathies, or pretends to, than does Trump, than does Biden, I should say. And so when Trump and Biden are on a debate stage talking about that colonial power, talking about the genocide which it has, and perhaps at that time, I don't know, is still perpetrating. Trump will try to prove, because he's doing it now, that he is even more of a Zionist than Biden. So the temporary lead that Biden endures, basically 3 points, not that much, will, I think, most likely collapse, or at least it will become 50-50. And the pessimism that supporters of Joe Biden have right now will be erased. I suspect that will happen during the debates, because Trump will present himself as a worse alternative to Biden when it comes to dealing with the colonial power. So I don't know what will happen. I don't know who will be elected. Do I care? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Biden, as I've said before, is fascistic. Trump, it appears to me, is a full-blown fascist in the style of Benito Mussolini. So based upon that, one might think that I would oppose Trump more than Biden. But how can I do that? Watching what Biden is doing right now, sending money, sending weapons, defending that colonial power. How can I support Trump? How can I support Biden? The answer is, I cannot support either one of them, and I don't, and I never will. I have never voted in an American election, presidential or otherwise. That is a promise that I made as a kid. Most people did not take me seriously, and yet here I am at 68 years old, having fulfilled my promise, to not do anything which will support the American system, like voting. And I have not. I have not, and I am happy to admit that. I have said that in YouTube comments, and I get the predictable critiques like, well, then you have no right to complain about the situation. And my response is, when did I ever complain about the situation? The situation I am complaining about is support for the colonial power, which both candidates have said that they will continue. Even if Trump claims that he will support the colonial power more than Biden, can he? What more can Trump do than Biden has done already? Maybe there is something, but if there is, I cannot imagine it. So, here we are at a time when, like Israel, but not in precisely the same way, we are seeing the United States being eaten up from the inside out. We are seeing a deterioration of the American political system. We are seeing the possibility of Trump being the next president, as well as the former president of the United States. That could happen. And he has said all these things that he wants to do, all of which are frightening than the one before, all of which I think will lead perhaps to the total and complete ruin of the United States. But the United States is heading down that path of ruin, even right now. Even right now. It's not like Trump or Biden can make it worse, although maybe they can. Maybe they can, but I don't see how. The dialectic, the wonderful dialectic, and the causal mechanism of karma, which forms a part of that dialectic, is getting its vengeance on the US and on the colonial power. Both are under its watch. Both are experiencing tremendous societal dislocations as a result of the actions that they themselves have taken in advance of the empire, in advance of American imperialism. And American imperialism has not worked for a long time. A long time. Go back to the Korean War. Neither the US nor Korea won that war. There was never a peace treaty or armistice signed, and so technically, the US is still at war with North Korea. Look at the Vietnam War. The Viet Cong beat the United States, and beat the United States badly, very badly, and drove out the United States. Look at Iraq, which is a somewhat more complex situation as to who won and who lost. But I would say that basically the US lost. Why? The US regards one of its major enemies as being Iran. And the relationship between Iraq and Iran is now very, very close. And so the efforts by the US to transform Iran into a Western-style democracy have failed miserably. Failed miserably. Why? If you go back to the time when Saddam Hussein was in charge of Iraq, it was not that bad. Saddam Hussein was actually a pretty decent leader. He brought together the Sunni and the Shia. They became friends, associates with one another. Then, all of a sudden, after the US had supported Iraq for so many years, including in its war against Iran, suddenly, in 2 consecutive wars, one fought by George H.W. Bush and one fought by George W. Bush, the U.S. failed. The U.S. failed. I would say that Iraq now is in a worse situation in many respects, not in all, but in many respects, than it was during the time of Saddam Hussein. Again, despite the rhetoric, despite the propaganda, Saddam Hussein was not a bad leader. I don't know if you have ever seen the photograph of Donald Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein shaking hands with one another. That was in the days when the US and Iraq had a friendly relationship. But friendship can change on a whim, especially in politics. And that is what happened. And so, for reasons that were basically lies, lying about Iraq's non-existent weapons of mass destruction, Colin Powell, who actually presented those lies and never forgave the George W. Bush administration for making him lie about that. That was a major turning point, I think, in the US. The US was willing to tell a lie, an entirely made-up story that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Now, France, for example, knew that they did not exist, or at least they had evidence that they did not exist. And so you had this member of Congress go to the congressional cafeteria and demand that French fries be changed to freedom fries when it became apparent that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That congressman, who at least had some level of integrity, apologized to the congressional cafeteria. That is good. It is good to have at least some moral compass. And that congressman had some moral compass. I would argue not as much as I would like, because he supported the war on Iraq initially, but he had some moral compass. So, going back to the main thesis of what I am saying here, Israel is falling apart economically and is playing the old switcheroo. Misdirection, sleight of hand. Look here, don't look there. Trying to get the world and maybe even his own citizens to focus on something else than the fact that Israel is economically falling apart. The United States, too, is falling apart, but in a different way. The rise of the far right, the rise of Marjorie Taylor Greene, and people who may be even further to the right than her. The fact that Trump, as it looks right now, which can change, appears on the road to victory in November, which means that he will be elected president and sworn in January. That, I think, would be a disaster for the status quo in the United States. Would that be a disaster for the world? I would say no. Why? Because if that colonial power and the US fall from their present position of imperialism, if they lose their money, if they lose their ability to function, the world will be far better off. And perhaps, and I don't know, I have no special inside track on knowledge, but perhaps the absence of those two countries from the empire, which means that there wouldn't be exactly an empire anymore, an American empire, would mean that the chances of the first world falling would be dramatically increased. And if the first world falls, it is likely that the capitalist world system will fall with it. I think that that is pretty indisputable to anyone who has carefully considered world events. And so, again, I am happy about that one thing. I mourn for all the innocent people that are being killed mercilessly in Gaza, despite the head of the colonial powers' claims, lies. I am happy that those two countries may fall. I have expected them to fall for a long time. In fact, I must say that I expected them to fall a long time ago, so I was wrong, as I have frequently been wrong with my predictions. But now, I don't think I am wrong. I might be. Again, my track record is not good. So trusting me is probably not a good idea. Consulting other sources and reading or listening to what they say may be the safest course. But still, that is a conviction which I have at this moment, that both the United States and the colonial power within its empire will collapse in the not too distant future. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.